Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session on PhotoWo, a wonderful interview. Today, we've got an expert educator, a Photoshop educator for you, Dave Cross. He's been with Photoshop almost since the beginning, very beginning, since 1990. He knows all about Photoshop. He knows all the niggling problems which are there in the first few versions. He's watched those features come and go. And I'm sure he'd give us a great insight about how Photoshop was and how it's evolved over these years. He's an educator. He teaches, he mentors, and he builds Photoshop experts. Now, nothing more noble than that. But the exciting thing is he's built a commercial model around that. So he helps, he builds, and he offers these services of training in person, and more so now because of the pandemic, online, through virtual summits, and of course his recordings and tutorials. Tutorials are available on Creative Live, on our website, on PhotoWo. You can check those out. The links will be there in the article below. And I'll now let him introduce himself to us. Over to you, Dave.
Well, thank you. You did actually a great job, because that's, in a nutshell, I always tell people it's pretty simple. I've been a Photoshop educator since 1990. So I taught my first Photoshop class literally 2 weeks after it first came out to a group of 6 people who were, back then, the most common users of Photoshop were in the printing business, where they were trying to move their business from doing everything traditionally to doing desktop publishing, as it was being called back then. And my only goal at that point was, I figured I had to at least know more than those 6 people, because it had been out only for 2 weeks, so it hadn't had a lot of time. But the good thing was there was only, like, I think 10 or 11, maybe 12 tools in the whole program. So it was very different because no one had ever seen it before. But I was teaching other software programs at that time, similar programs like, page layout and things like that. But once I got into Photoshop and teaching it and seeing the light bulb go off when you'd show someone something and they'd be like, oh, that solves my problem, or now I get it, made me realize this is what I just need to be doing all the time, because it's a very rewarding feeling to have someone count on you to give them an answer or teach them something that they don't understand, and have them look at you and go, oh, that reaction of, I get it. So that's all I've been doing in one form or another for the last 30 something years. Initially in classrooms and seminar rooms and conferences. And then, of course, once the internet was allowing us to do things like video online, then I started doing some more online work. And that's been my main thing, especially, as you mentioned, since the pandemic. That's been main thing I've been doing, because, of course, I'm not currently teaching at any online events. And most of the ones that I used to go and teach at are now having online versions of them. So you can, this is my home studio where I do all my teaching now, whether it's live through something like Zoom or recordings that I have on my site.
Fantastic. Okay, it's a pleasure to have you, Dave. And I hope, and thank you for agreeing to share your knowledge and your experience with our viewers. It's much appreciated.
Sure.
Okay, so let's get into some questions about your core expertise, about Photoshop itself. So one of the things that Photoshop gets a great name for is, of course, that you can change one thing into another. You can morph, you can metamorph, you can change. But that's also something that it gets a bad name for. It's not, people say, oh, this is Photoshopped. Actually, Photoshopped has become, it's almost become a verb, right?
Right, yeah.
And people do this with not so flattering places and comedy, and then sometimes people get offended as well. So Photoshop has both extremes. But there are a host of designers, photographers, creative people who really use Photoshop for enhancing rather than simply brushing the errors away or clearing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain this to a newcomer or somebody who says, oh no, I don't use Photoshop, I like my photos or my work to be sort of pure?
Sure.
I'm sure you've had
and I've always had the philosophy that speaking to an individual, ultimately the image is yours. So you do whatever you wish. And if that means that you want to take a photo and literally not do anything to it and say, this is exactly how I captured it, great. If you want to replace the sky because the day you were out at that amazing place that the sky happened to be not very interesting, also great. And even the people that, as you mentioned, do things that are perhaps crossing the line a bit, where they alter, put another face on someone's body or something. I mean, obviously that's not the best, for me, the best use of the program. But ultimately, for me personally, when I'm looking at images on screen, the thing that I'm always thinking of is I want to create something that I'm proud of and that I would love to print and put on my wall. And if that means that all I do is crop it, great. If it means that I create a whole composite of images that never actually existed in real life, that's fine too. So I've always had I wouldn't say a problem with, but a concern where I hear people say, that's not real photography, or that's not, real. It's been altered. Well, the other side of the argument is even the longtime photography experts did a lot of stuff in the darkroom to their negatives to make it a print the way they wanted. And it wasn't exactly the way it looked directly out of the camera. It just happens that as we say, our darkroom is now a digital darkroom. So it's all about the image. It's all about what makes you happy, as long as you're not doing anything for illegal purposes where you're trying to, make, fake IDs for someone or passports or whatever. That's, again, crossing the line. But, do whatever it is that makes you happy with the image that you create. If I'd hate, for example, here's an example. I went to Italy a number of years ago, and it happened, we went at a time where every day we were there, the sky was gray.
Okay.
Every single day. So I was doing my best, but photographically, when people say things like, this is one of my favorite expressions, I hear people say, well, get it right in the camera. Well, in that case, getting it right would be, now I'd have a beautiful picture of a gray sky, on this otherwise beautiful scene of Venice or whatever. So I had no problems whatsoever replacing the sky with one that looked better, because it, to me, created a better representation of what it should have looked like if we'd been there at almost any other time except the time we were there. So, and when I hopefully do a good enough job and print it off and show it to people, none of my friends are going to walk up and go, oh, that sky looks fake to me. I mean, if it does, then I didn't do a very good job. But hopefully their reaction is just, wow, what a nice picture of Venice.
Yeah, excellent. Yes. So basically, the end photo is your creation, whatever you do with it. That's the while you were saying that, I realized another thing. The lens, the film, or the sensor, it does the same thing. It adds layers, it filters, it modifies, it granulates, it does something. It's literally not what the eye sees. Even your eye does that, for God's sake, when you look at a picture.
Exactly.
So those who say it's pure, you're just saying, no, that's what Nikon decided. That's what
exactly. Well, and it's that whole expression where people say, get it right in the camera. I agree that you shouldn't just take a photo without any thought of proper exposure. But like I said, sometimes the natural environment that you're in, for example, let's say you're inside your house and the light is streaming through the window. Well, if you expose for the window, then the room will be too dark. And vice versa. So there's really no way to get it exactly right. All you can do is capture that moment. But if you know what Photoshop could do, then you would capture a couple of different versions, one exposed for the light, one exposed for the room, and then use Photoshop to combine them and end up with a photo that actually works. So sometimes the purists, quote unquote, that say get it right in camera means they pass up opportunities because there is no way to capture it in one photo just based on the environment they're in.
Yeah, that's a lovely example. Thank you for that, Dave. Yes, that's a really excellent example of how and where you can really do things which you normally can with a happy ending, with an excellent outcome, which will please the viewers. Excellent. So that takes me to the next question. I know, you're a fan of layers. I've heard that you prefer using layers and hiding and moving them behind and in front rather than flattening and rather than making it, using eraser or overwriting tools. Can you share some of this technique? I think this is I was really intrigued by it because while everybody knows Photoshop is well known for its layers and its technique, it's possibly a technique which is avoided by beginners or maybe even some intermediate users because they're worried about some aspect of using layers. Have you found any such situations? Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I think so first of all, I'd say that there's in a global sense, there's two ways of working in Photoshop. One is my preference, which is what's referred to as working non-destructively, which means do everything in a way that gives you the chance to change your mind, try different things, experiment, etc. So that would include things like layers and adjustment layers and masking as opposed to erasing, that kind of thing. And the alternate way is to do things in a destructive manner, which means if you have something on your photo you don't like, you erase it. Well, excuse me, in Photoshop terms, when you erase something, those pixels are gone. So if 10 or 15 steps later, you realize, I wish I hadn't erased quite as much, you're kind of out of luck and you have to start again. So working non-destructively, including things like layers, just means it gives you more opportunities than you don't have. And the only downside to working non-destructively, and this is it's a consideration, is that your files get much bigger. Right. And for some people, that's the concern, is they'll say things like, oh, but my file is getting so big. And without sounding facetious, my answer is always, well, then go buy more storage. Right. Because storage is cheap today. It's really inexpensive to buy an enormous hard drive that you can save these big files on. And I'd much rather spend a little bit of money, get a bigger hard drive, and have these big files than the alternative, which is work for an hour and then realize 45 minutes ago I shouldn't have done something, and now all that time is wasted because I have to start over again. Yeah. So the advantage is, a lot of people, when they hear people like me say work non-destructively, one of the common responses is, well, I never changed my mind. And well, first of all, I'm like, yeah, okay. But secondly, it's not just about changing your mind. It's also a wonderful way to be creative, because by nature, Photoshop is a very linear program. So you do things like step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when you want to undo, you can undo 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But what if you do those 5 steps and you wish you hadn't done 3? Right. You can't just remove 3 out of the middle by nature. Whereas if you've used layers and those 5 steps are 5 separate layers, you can in fact remove layer 3 and then keep working. So it really opens up for me the creative possibilities of experimentation that I wouldn't have if I did everything. Like, I'll watch people where they'll use a few layers, they'll get something done, then they'll merge them all together and then they'll continue. And I'm like, well, you just threw away the whole point of using layers, is that ability to keep trying things. And if the only reason that's holding you back is my file's getting really big, there's a solution to that.
A much more sensible solution than flattening, which is get more storage. Exactly. Yes, excellent.
Yeah. So I have an expression I've used for years that makes for a good joke, but it also kind of hopefully reminds people. And I say, flattening is like Photoshop's F word. Okay. It's bad and you shouldn't use it, because as soon as you flatten, you lose everything. So here's my number one tip is, there's a big difference between flattening and saving a flattened copy. It's a huge difference. Right. So when you flatten and save, everything's gone. Right. When you save it as a PSD file with all that lovely layer information, but you need, for example, a JPEG to post on social media, then you save a copy that's flattened. So you still end up with a version that does what you need in terms of file size and ability to be shared, etc. But if after you've saved that JPEG and posted it and someone says, did you mean to have this happen in that bottom left-hand corner? You can go back to your layered version, fix it, and then save a new copy. And to me, that's kind of the key factor of when people say flattening. A lot of people say that because they think they need to in order to have a JPEG. And it's, well, you don't need to, you need to make a version or copy that's flattened. And that's very, very different.
Right. Excellent. So there you have it, guys. Excellent. So don't flatten unnecessarily. If you do flatten it, make it non-destructively. So you make a flattened copy. So
Exactly.
why? There are two lovely reasons. The first reason is you might change your mind. And don't tell me you don't. We all know we do. Change your mind, but that's a good tip. And the second one that Dave mentioned, I really love that. The fact that you can actually mix and match the sequence of actions that you've done. You can pluck out action number 4. You can repeat action number 4, or you can knock it off completely. So work in layers, and flatten when needed, right at the end, and non-destructively, and get a better, bigger hard disk.
And so there's 2 other reasons why I suggest working non-destructively. The first is you can repurpose things. So say you did a project a year ago, right, and you'd spent 2 hours masking, I don't know, a tree.
Yeah.
So it was perfectly on its own layer. Now, a year later, you realize you could reuse that same tree. Well, you just go to that original file, take that layer and literally drag it into your new document, and you don't have to redo that work. Yeah. And the other reason, which is very valuable, especially for people over time, a lot of people who use Photoshop can relate to this, that it's not uncommon for people to just sort of experiment and try things in Photoshop and get some end result they love, but then they look at it a year later and go, how on earth did I do that?
Yeah.
Because I have no history to go back and say, what filter did I use? What did I do? Whereas if you've saved a layered non-destructive version, you can pretty much go back and figure out what you did and say, oh yeah, look at my layers. I used a curves adjustment layer and I did this smart filter with these settings. And that way you can almost reverse engineer and figure out how you did something. So there, like I said before, there's a lot more to working non-destructively than simply, oh, I changed my mind.
Yeah, fantastic. Excellent. Thanks for that, Dave. Okay, so the discussion on layers then takes us to an interesting dimension of Photoshop. We sell a lot of bundles, and I'm sure, and there's a lot of popularity on overlays. Overlays are big in Photoshop, aren't they?
Yes.
You get all types of overlays, like you said, could be backgrounds, could be skies, could be fantasy overlays like your stars and whatever. Are you a fan of overlays? Do you do a lot of overlays? What's your advice about usage of overlays?
I mean, I think like anything, it's personal taste. So when I'm teaching things and people talk about, like, people ask me all the time, for example, do you sell overlays? Do you sell actions? And my response say, I don't, mostly because my main goal is to teach you how to do it yourself. Now, obviously there's a place for purchasing packages of overlays because you don't necessarily have the ability to go out and capture everything. But at the same time, my hope is that people who use things like these purchased overlays, because I think there have wonderful possibilities, is to look at and say, that's a really good idea. I wonder if I took my own photo of a crumpled piece of paper, if I could somehow use that as well. And they kind of build off of that and figure out ways to do the similar thing with combining the elements you've purchased and your own. Yeah. So as an example, I have this event coming up called the Photoshop Virtual Summit. One of the instructors is teaching a class on textures and overlays, and she actually included at the beginning photos of her baking a piece of paper in the oven to actually create this wonderful texture that she can then photograph and use as an overlay. And I thought that was just a marvelous example to show that, yes, purchasing is great, but you can, once you see what those overlays can do, you can also start to explore what other possibilities there are as well.
Oh, excellent. That's great advice. And that's exactly what an educator would say. Figure it out yourself. By no means use what's out there. Purchase them, use them.
Oh, sure.
Free, but then understand how you can do it yourself. And someday you might find a great opportunity to build your own overlay. That's excellent. That's really exciting for me to hear, because that's, as you said, I think there is, as human beings, there is something really, really, we're really affectionate to something we create, right? We have that that parental instinct. So you create an overlay and it looks so beautiful.
Exactly.
And that's why most people spend so much time doing these things, right? Because it gives you great pleasure in creating something from your, and if you create something that others want to use or others appreciate, then it's like it's fantastic. It's just even better than the feeling of creation. So thanks for that. Yes, excellent. Okay, so the next point we're going to talk about, some people really don't like about Photoshop. Okay, so I don't know whether you like it, you encourage it or not. Converting photographs to paintings using Photoshop. I think personally, I think it's fascinating because you can do so many things, but some people don't like it. What's your opinion on that, Dave?
I mean, I really enjoy it. In fact, you obviously can't see this, but I'm looking like right there on my wall. I have a canvas print of a photograph of my daughter's cute dog that I turned into a painting. And because it's on canvas, right, a lot of people look at it and do a double take because it really does look very painterly. Now, right, having said that, I probably did that with that photograph and have never had quite that level of success in terms of it looking so realistic. And part of it is just because the nature of the dog's fur and everything just kind of lends itself to that. So that's what I would say, is that the ability in Photoshop to make something look like a painting, there are some built-in filters that will do it. But to me, it takes more than that. You need to do additional work, some kind of brushstrokes of your own to really make it, to sell it. And then the other thing, speaking of overlays, is a lot of places they'll include it in their packages are the texture that looks like brushstrokes. Right. I know there's a term in oil painting, and I can't remember what it's called right now, for that kind of texture and the 3D kind of look that it can create.
And they layer the paint on. Yes.
Right. So you can get that kind of overlay that can go on top of whatever you've done in Photoshop to make it look even more painterly. I will say that portraits of people are probably the hardest thing to make look like a painting, just because it's hard to make that look as realistic as real painters can. But for things like landscapes and others, it's getting easier. And again, it's back to what we said before. It's personal taste. If you love the look of turning a photo into a painting, then experiment and try it. Just do it non-destructively, and then you may well end up with something that you love.
Yeah, excellent. Yes. So I guess it's personal taste, as you said. And when you said that, I remember something. There is this genre of painters who actually do the inverse. I'm sure you've heard of them. Mm-hmm. Make a painting look like a photograph. They work endlessly to make it look exactly like a photo. So I guess, we humans, we just love to do the tough stuff because we enjoy doing something difficult and then being excited about the outcome.
So one of the instructors for the virtual summit, his name is Bert Monroy, and he's been involved also in Photoshop since its very early days, but he is a commercial illustrator who creates these unbelievable, like when you see them, you think you're looking at a photograph,
right?
And then it becomes more and more obvious as he on the screen zooms in. So for example, there might be a scene of a street in some town, and one of the things in the street is a little restaurant. Well, then he zooms in on the restaurant, and on the table, there's a tablecloth, and he zooms in closer, and you can see the salt in the salt shaker. I mean, it's his level of detail is astounding, but he'll take literally, in some cases, years. Like he'll go in thinking this is a 2-year project to create this mammoth, like he did one of Times Square as an example. That's, I forget, but it's something like 60 feet by 4 feet. I mean, it's a huge tableau that's been displayed at different trade shows, and it's an incredible amount of detail. When people asked him, why wouldn't you just take a photograph at that point? He's like, because it's the journey. It's that, for me, the fulfilling of that desire to, he takes reference photographs, but then he creates everything from scratch in both Illustrator and Photoshop to create these photorealistic images that are just staggering. And that's what he loves to do. Other people would say, yeah, I'll put my camera on a tripod and take a panoramic photo. Thank you very much. Yeah. And that's, again, it comes back to the same thing of it's all what you prefer.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And then, we touched upon, you mentioned it briefly, filters. You mentioned using a filter for possibly changing the image a bit. And then there are actions and then scripts, so the dimension of Photoshop where you can encapsulate repetitive tasks or even automate repetitive tasks. Are you a fan of using these techniques? What would you recommend?
I'm a huge fan of anything I can do to automate my work. Now, having said that, I will suggest that many people, when I say the word automation in Photoshop, they immediately think of actions, which is just one aspect. To me, automation is also keyboard shortcuts, because that's faster than going to menus. So I'm kind of a keyboard shortcut junkie. I use keyboard shortcuts for everything. My wife kids me because I can remember keyboard shortcuts better than like people's birthdays and things like that. So I use keyboard shortcuts all the time. So to me, that's a form of automation. Now, when I'm teaching, I try not to do that without explaining it, because I want people to see where things are. But the other part of it is action. So an action is like a pre-recorded series of steps, and the pros and cons that you can get actions from people that someone else has recorded that does a very particular function, like take this photograph and turn it into a cartoon, or take this photograph and whatever the end result. And while I think those are useful and there's a place for them, my favorite use of actions is something that I refer to as a starter action. What I mean by that is, on a lot of photographs in Photoshop, you may wish to play with light and dark. So like dark in some areas, light in some areas. So the way I would typically do that is to add 2 different adjustment layers and then mask them. Well, because every single time I do that, that would mean me going new adjustment layer, adjust, okay, fill the mask with black, second adjustment layer. That part never changes, even though the image changes. So what I record is an action that gets me right up to the point of now using those. So in other words, the action would be add an adjustment layer, adjust it to be lighter, fill the mask with black, add a second adjustment layer to darken, and then stop recording. So now when on my next image, instead of me having to do that repetitive step, I just simply play that starter action, which literally gets me started. And then I can decide which layer I want to go on and adjust. And I think, to me, that's perhaps the most valuable type of action, because it doesn't matter what type of image you're working with, it gets you started. Whereas many other, what I would call A to Z actions, mean it's either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, then you're kind of out of luck. So I like creating my own actions which get me started with whatever I need to do.
Excellent. Yes, thank you for that. And that, by the way, I think from some of our customers who purchased actions, if anything, that's one of the potential complaints, saying, hey, it doesn't work well on my image.
Right.
So yes, so there are a type of images where the actions are supposed to work on. They'll work wonderfully, light, dark, size, resolution. And yes, so what Dave's suggesting is to build your own library of actions, stuff that you do again and again and again, bits and pieces, keep them generic, keep them so that you can run those actions on all your projects that you start off with. That's a wonderful suggestion, Dave. And I think, it might look initially when you start off that it's a trivial thing, saving a few seconds, I can quickly do it or whatever. But then I think those seconds add up real quick, don't they?
Oh, for sure. And especially for someone, let's say you went on a trip somewhere and you have hundreds of images that you took, and you've gone through them and you've said, okay, these are my 25 favorites.
Right.
Well, on each one of those, if you have to add an adjustment layer, do the same kind of operations, yes, it's only a few seconds, but now you're multiplying that times all those images. And the other part is, it's just, the fun part is adjusting it.
Yeah.
It's not so much fun getting ready to adjust. So if you can automate that part, it means you just jump right into the fun part.
Yeah. Excellent. That's excellent. That's awesome advice, Dave. Thank you for that. Okay. And so you did, when you speak about BERT, you did touch upon another interesting topic that I'd like to speak about now. So obviously Photoshop is the marquee product Adobe has, but there's a suite of products around it, isn't it? There's Illustrator, there's Lightroom, and then there's After Effects for videos. So do you work with any of the other tools, or would you like to comment on which typical, a person who's sort of building a career or a business or a commercial activity around Photoshop, which tool would you recommend you sort of fuel up in terms of complementary usage?
Sure.
Or is Photoshop enough?
Well, I mean, on some level, depending on what you're doing, Photoshop could be enough, but I think it really depends. So for example, a photographer, there are many photographers that use Lightroom in addition to Photoshop, because Lightroom is kind of like an all-in-one program where you can organize your photographs, work on them on a sort of a global level. And then if you want to do things with layers, you jump over to Photoshop. Now, there's some people that use Lightroom only because they feel the type of work they do, they don't benefit from things like layers, although I would suggest many people who feel that way probably haven't really tried some of the things you can do in Photoshop.
Right.
And then on the other side of things, from anyone who's doing something more, shall we say, from a design or page layout type of thing, I personally mostly use Photoshop with tools like Illustrator and InDesign would probably be the trio that I use the most, because here's an example. While you could design a logo in Photoshop, it's not the best place to do it.
Right.
Because Photoshop is by nature a pixel-based program, which means from the moment you create your first image, if you were going to create a logo, if you made it very small, that's pretty much the size of it. So if someone says, well, I love that logo, let's put it on the side of a truck, you'd be in trouble because it would not blow up and, it would not be expanded very easily. Whereas in Illustrator, that's what it's meant for. Illustrator is a vector-based program, which means by nature, there's no such thing as resolution. So you could literally make a tiny logo for a business card and blow it up to the side of a truck or an airplane without any problems whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the two work very well together. So I create a logo in Illustrator, I put it in a library, Creative Cloud library in Illustrator, and then when I'm in Photoshop, it shows up in the same library, and I literally just drag it from the library onto my image in Photoshop. So it still appears in Photoshop, but technically it lives in Illustrator. So let's say I'd created a logo and I'd use red, white, and blue, and then after I put it in Photoshop and done 10 more steps, I realized that it should be green, white, and blue, or green, white, and red, or some combination of colors. In Photoshop, I just double click on the logo, it opens Illustrator, I edit it, save it, and it updates in Photoshop. So it's a really nice kind of a two-way editing street between the Adobe application. So that's just one example. I mean, it's certainly, you can do the same thing between Photoshop and After Effects. They've done a really nice job of that kind of interoperability, I guess you'd say, where you can move files back and forth in their native format. So you still have the layers in Photoshop, but you can use those layers in After Effects or Illustrator or in InDesign, for example.
Right. Excellent. Those are fantastic examples, Dave. Thank you for that. I think what you said towards the end was really right. I mean, Adobe has done a wonderful job of integrating all these tools together. I guess that's been their challenge over the decades, to always stay ahead of the lower cost and the freer products, in creating so much value for the people who use the product that the price sort of just pays itself back in usage.
Yes, for sure.
I think even the Creative Cloud, where everything is available in one place, with one subscription, is really I know they took a lot of flack when they went into subscription, didn't they, Adobe? I'm sure you remember those days when they moved from perpetual license to subscription. But I had a lot
of people that were mad at me, like I had something to do with it, just because I teach Adobe products. They were like yelling at me in their emails going, how could they do that? I'm like, I don't know. But I guess it's the kind of thing, it's what you're used to. So if you're used to paying a one-time fee and then use the software as much as you want, for some people that became an issue. Whereas I look at the other way and go, for the monthly cost that Adobe has for all of their products. Yes. So for example, I was working on a project recording something and something was wrong with the audio. And my software that I use for screen recording doesn't have very much in the way of audio tools. And so I thought, oh, wait a minute, I have the Creative Cloud, and I went and downloaded Audition, which is Adobe's audio program, having never used it. Took me a minute to get used to it, but I was able to see, look at that, there's a healing brush in the audio software, just like there's a healing brush in Photoshop. I was amazed at that. So if I didn't have the Creative Cloud, I would have had to go looking for some other means of adjusting my audio. So I hardly use that program very much at all, but it's nice to know if I do need it, it's just there as part of my Creative Cloud subscription, as opposed to having to go purchase something or find an alternate tool.
Right, fantastic. Yes, that's a lovely example of a practical situation where the access to all the tools at your fingertips, it can really save you, if not time, definitely time, but a lot of headache, and possibly
Yep.
come up with an outcome which is of much higher quality, because exporting, working on a different software, re-importing can be a nightmare, can be a terrible
Yeah.
thing. Excellent.
Now, to be fair, I should also mention that, some people may not, if you're strictly a photographer and think, I'm never going to use page layout software, I'm never going to create logos, then Adobe also has the photography plan, which is just Photoshop and Lightroom. In the US, it's like $10 a month.
Right.
So $10 a month to get those two powerhouse photography programs. I mean, that's like, I don't drink coffee, but I'm sure if I did, I'd say that's like a couple of cups of coffee at Starbucks, and I'm paying for my, is it for one? Okay. So that shows how much I know about coffee.
Yeah, if you go for the souped up one,
the big one.
Yes, yes. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Yes. So Dave, would you would you like to share something about yourself, your family, where you live, and where do you see the Photoshop and the digital industry moving? Just some thoughts and some vision, because you've been here, you've seen all the ups and the downs, and you've seen the competitors trying to pry, and you've seen so many things. So we'd love to hear about Dave, the person, your family, where you live. We'd love to know something about
Sure.
you, and
Well,
where the industry is going.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Canada, and then about 20 years ago moved to Florida for a job, actually at a place that hired me to be another Photoshop educator. And so we've lived here for, like I said, 20 years, and I have two children, both of whom, after we moved to the US, met someone and got married here. So you're welcome, children. And we have two grandsons now that live very close to us here in Tampa. So it's wonderful. That's a new phase of life for me, is to be the granddad, which is awesome. And so family's always been very important to me. So the fact that I still get to spend as much time as I do with my children, sometimes it's via technology like FaceTime or Zoom, but other times it's in person. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier, so I set up this room I'm in now, is one of the rooms in my house that I have is this little kind of recording studio, which is where I do all my tutorials. And to me, that's still kind of a fascinating thought, to think that it really wasn't that long ago that the only way to impart information was sitting in a room with people, either a classroom or a seminar room. I mean, I used to teach seminars where I'd have 800 people in the room, and I'd be sitting there with a projector showing them how to do things in Photoshop, which was a great number, but it meant that was 800 people from New York or LA or wherever we happened to be. And those people who didn't happen to be able to travel that far, they couldn't do it. So I still remember the very first time I saw video on a Macintosh, and it was a little tiny postage stamp video that lasted like 15 seconds. We're all like, oh my gosh, video, that's amazing. Never even dreaming that we'd be having like this, like a conversation over, technology. So I think as far as what the future holds, I know that one of the things, and just kind of tied back into what we talked about before about the Creative Cloud, I know one of the comments I received a lot from people who were not very happy about the subscription model was comments like, well, what's the motivation for Adobe to innovate anymore, and when they know they have our money every month? Well, the good news is that's not Adobe's DNA. The way they're made, they're always innovative. So I know that as much as we've been impressed with changes in Photoshop over the years, like layers and smart filters and content aware technology, and now some of the AI technology they have using this thing called Adobe Sensei for things like select subject, where it automatically helps you make a selection, that's just going to continue. That's going to get better and better. And what we'll probably see is more things that are cloud-based, where you'll be able to literally upload a photograph to a cloud and they'll be able to download a version which some addition or change has been made on your behalf that you can either accept or not. And of course, the other side of it is these devices, which used to be used for making phone calls, now you're going to be able to actually use Photoshop or a version of it on your phone. So if you're out taking photos with your device, you can make adjustments to it on a basic level. And then once you get back to your home, automatically see those changes in your desktop or laptop version and continue working. So I think there's exciting times ahead because Adobe is already, for example, has a version of Photoshop that works on a laptop, which is not exactly the same, but it has some similarities. So that again, you can work on it on a mobile device somewhere and then automatically connect to your more traditional desktop. And some people may not even have a desktop device anymore. They'll only use their phone and their tablet, and they'll get very good results. So I think there's interesting time ahead, and I try to keep my finger on the pulse of what Adobe's up to, and then it looks very interesting to see how much they're trying to balance between keeping the core functions that we know and love in Photoshop and adding new things that, if you want to use them, can save you time and allow you to be more creative.
Yes, excellent. Yes, I absolutely. Some of the things that came to my mind, Dave, when you were expressing how you stand in front of 800 people, how you drive there, how you'd struggle for parking there, how you'd forget something after reaching there, and so because of that, you would end up carrying doubles and triples of everything to your next conference. So life has changed tremendously. I think the reach, we live in a blessed time when you can reach out to thousands, if not millions of people from the comfort or at least the convenience of your home. That's a lovely time. And I think we should all be collectively grateful for people like you who've actually used your time productively in sharing this information, in teaching. They say the noblest profession, right? Teaching, getting people to use the product more effectively and becoming creators themselves, not just consumers of what something else.
Right, exactly.
Yes, that's a lovely lovely business, or a lovely lovely piece of work, lovely work to do. I would like to share, of course, so Dave is on social media. He's on Twitter. His Twitter handle is Dave Cross, simple, DAVECROSS. He's on Photoshop, he's on Facebook, he's on Instagram. PS Guy.
PS Guy Dave Cross is.
Yeah. Okay, so he is known as the PS Guy. Okay, PS Guy Dave Cross on Facebook and on Instagram. So you can join in there. You can send him tweets, and he'll get back to you. His website is learningphotoshop.cc. Check out some of the courses. There are some free courses there as well. Some very reasonably priced courses. Please check them out. Rest assured, you will learn stuff from a veteran, from a master of Photoshop. In fact, I would like to take the opportunity now. PhotoWow has some products and some courses of Dave's that we promote and sell. I'd like to read out a couple of testimonials we received recently. So Sharon says, "You just can't beat the instruction you received from Dave Cross. LOL. While I doubt I will ever become a master like in PS, I'm becoming very comfortable with the software, much of it due to Mr. Dave." Hey. I have another excellent one. Dave Cross is a great instructor in photograph. I've taken a few courses with him, and I'm glad I purchased these PhotoWow tutorial bundles. So try him out. Go through some of his website. He's on Creative Live, he's on PhotoWow, and he's on his own website, learningphotoshop.cc. You'll find all those links in the article below. And you reach out to him if you have questions, if you want advice. I'm sure you get a ton of that, but he'll answer. He'll give you whatever help he can. Very, very helpful approach he has in his responses. So thank you so much once again, Dave. We wish you all the best. Thank you for taking the time out to reach out to our audience. I really hope your journey in Photoshop continues. I wish you all the best in that. And thank you for sharing your nuggets of wisdom with us and the audience.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. There's nothing I love talking about more than Photoshop, especially when I'm able to give another plug for working non-destructively.
Fantastic. Excellent. Excellent. Take care, Dave. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.